Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the latest installment of Building the Scottish State with myself, Dr. Mark McNaught. And I have the great pleasure of having with me Professor and a lot of other things, Alf Baird, with us to speak about the Treaty of Union, independence, maritime policy, and whatever else comes up. So first of all, Alf, thanks so much for being with us this evening.
Thank you, Mark.
Okay, let's start out with the Treaty of Union. We were discussing when we were discussing the other night the idea that a referendum is not a good way to go for some of the reasons that you can explain. And as you were pointing out, it was accepted by Tories and many and very hardcore conservatives up until recently, at least, that simply electing a majority of Scottish, nationalist Scottish MPs would be enough to have independence. How do you see that, and what do you think has changed since, say, Thatcher, that this is not really being widely considered as an option for becoming independent?
Well, I think it's always been accepted that by the political establishment in England as well as Scotland, that a majority of nationalist MPs was sufficient for Scotland to withdraw from the Union and the treaty. In fact, in many territories, a majority of nationalist members advocating independence are elected to a legislature, that's normally it means de jure independence, which is the case in even in many former colonies. Scotland has additional benefits in having a treaty-based alliance. So the UK is basically as far as I could see in my research, it's basically a treaty-based alliance arrangement where you have a joint governing administration and a joint parliament. But essentially the sovereign entities, the treaty signatory parties under international law, are always at liberty to withdraw from the alliance as is understood in any treaty-based arrangement.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. And how do you understand? Tell us a little bit historically about how the Treaty of Union came about. It's often portrayed as being, voluntary, that the Scots, it's a voluntary union. Therefore, Scotland's not a colony. And I know that you don't see it that way. So if you can explain, why is Scotland, if it was a voluntary union, why do you think? Why do people not see, some people see Scotland as a colony?
Well, the research I did on that for my book is another aspect. But I think going back to what Kenny McCaskill said to you in a previous interview, I agree with what he said, that we know that historically, and Professor Tom Devine has come up with this view, I think, as well, that there was a lot of coercion going on pre-1707 for Scotland to be pushed into a union with armies massing nearby and other threats coming around. Bear in mind that Scotland has always been a target for English elites for 500 years previously. So it wasn't anything new, this type of thing. And what we saw were elites within Scotland deciding. Of course, there was no democracy at the time. Democracy was rather, you couldn't really define the situation at the time as democratic. There was only an elite running the Scottish Parliament at the time, self-elected largely. And these elites voted for the Union for their own self-interest. The people as a whole were totally opposed to the Union, and there was civil unrest and riots. There was also a subsequent armed conflict in the 1745. So it was no way a democratic treaty. It was, and if you see within the treaty whose interests were protected, it was the three main institutions of bourgeoisie, if you like, but also aristocrats were protected within that treaty arrangement. I include in that context the judiciary, the clergy, and the educational establishments, universities, and so on. So there were various interests protected, their status and privileges were protected and still are under the Treaty of Union. So this was a treaty based on self-interest of elites. It wasn't a treaty democratic, and it wasn't undertaken or agreed to by the vast majority of anyone in Scotland.
Okay. All right. And do you see a way of and what would you think would be necessary for Scotland withdrawing from the Treaty of Union to be internationally recognized? I don't know whether that could be adjudicated by the UN, their decolonization committee, or I mean, what possible scenarios do you see of Scotland, of maybe Scottish MPs withdrawing from the Treaty of Union and then have it be internationally recognized? Because as you said in our conversation last Saturday, many people are just not aware of the nature of what Britain actually is.
Well, that's right, Mark. The international community are generally unaware that Scotland and England are only joined together by a single treaty, the Treaty of Union. Most countries around the world and supranational organisations consider Scotland to be a territory of the UK, and also they have no concept of the question of the sovereignty of the people, which is distinct for Scotland and also agreed by various legislators, including Westminster and Holyrood, that sovereignty remains with the Scottish people themselves. So we have a treaty, we have sovereignty. In a sense, Scotland is already independent. Mm-hmm. It just needs to assert and exercise sovereignty. And that is normally done, as I said at the beginning, through once a majority of nationalist representatives are elected in a country, they hold the sovereignty of the people and they are required to exercise and assert that sovereignty. So far with the SNP, they've not asserted that sovereignty. They've failed to do so. And that brings us back to the post-colonial literature, which explains why that is the case.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And why is that the case? And I know that there are people out there that would, and it's only dawned on me recently, that Scotland is in many ways a colony. I mean, my dad was Scottish and he would have never characterized Scotland that way. And I know a lot of people don't. And I think a lot of people, believe that it was a voluntary union, that and that we, they've been through the wars together, and that we share so much, with the English and the other and Wales and Ireland. But in what sense do you view Scotland as a colony?
Well, it's not just me. It's the research I undertook for my book, Doun-Hauden, The Socio-Political Determinants of Scottish Independence, was also a study of colonialism and what that came up with in the theoretical sense. And the three dimensions of colonialism are political control is out with the country is subject to economic and exploitation and plunder, and is also a colony may or may not be subject to settler colonization. So when you look at in detail all of these aspects, it's pretty clear that Scotland fits pretty well, pretty nicely into that, almost like a 300-year-old glove, if you like. That brings us then to the reality that yes, although there is a treaty, it's not really respected. It's a bit like a marriage agreement where people might enter into a marriage agreement, but it might not necessarily be an equal marriage. Mm-hmm. And it might have one bullying party, or one dominant party that takes the spoils, and the others left with nothing, or very little, or certainly less than their share. So that's colonialism. Is that it's basically colonialism is force, but it's also exploitation of the assets and resources that are available, and it leads one party, one nation in this case, to be underdeveloped as to what it would be had it been in control of its affairs. That brings us to then the post-colonial literature, which gives us a kind of template about the process and what happens when you have a dominant national party, as we have. And what that literature tells us is it settles into what they call an accommodation with the colonial power, an accommodation with colonialism, where it doesn't push independence. I mean, the SNP's had 6 majorities. And it's basically done nothing with any of them. Most former colonies would have declared independence long before now with the first national majority. And that was what the Tories previously back in the 90s would have accepted as well. So they have that. The reason they go into this accommodation with colonialism, of course, is a couple of reasons. One is they don't really understand what independence is. And if Scotland is subject to colonial oppression, then independence then becomes decolonisation, which is a realisation that people then have to try and understand. And this narrative, this issue hasn't really been discussed because it also leads to what we call a colonial mindset in many respects, which holds a people back from establishing their liberation, if you like. The other factor is the dominant National Party tends to be more the bourgeoisie elements, and therefore they like their power, they like the rewards that they have from this, and they become, in effect, a colonial administration, and are rewarded as such for that. They then hold back the radical elements and hold down and even persecute the radical elements, as we've seen in the cases with prosecutions of various leading independence campaigners. So the dominant National Party aligns with the colonial powers to do this, to hold back the independence movement, the radicals, and to smear them and do whatever it can to delay independence. And that's essentially what it's been doing. At the same time, we see the rise of new national parties, which we're seeing in Scotland now with Alba and with others. So we're seeing this whole template is working out. The post-colonial template is happening as we watch now, and it has all the same characteristics. The difficulty arises, things become progressively or deteriorate progressively as decolonisation is delayed further.
Okay, and where do you see Scotland along that spectrum? Where do you, in what stage? I mean, and can you give an analogous an analogy in another British colonial country and how they became independent? Where Scotland is along that spectrum?
Well, there's many examples, but I think the closest example might well be Ireland. And I don't think it's any accidents that we saw the other weekend 38 orange walks in Scotland, and to think that Scotland is unlike Ireland too much, I think would be wishful thinking. I think what we see in Scotland we see the movement of different sides of the divide, if you like. The colonial side and the anti-colonial side. So that's what we're seeing. That's what we're witnessing in Scotland. How it pans out is difficult to see, but at the end of the day, the colonial power has to back off, has to back down for a people to be free, as it were. Otherwise, we're in a situation where colonial force, if you like, will worsen from the establishment, from those in power, as we see with the various entities in terms of the persecutions of independence campaigners, and also the restrictions of marches, the restrictions of freedoms, liberties, the enactment of new laws such as the hate crime law. These are all part of the same process that we have to be aware of. We have to also remember that if we go back to the colonialism thesis, colonialism itself is racism. And it's based on the idea that one people on their culture and their ethnicity is inferior to another. And all peoples in self-determination conflict are linguistically divided. And the thesis in my book was that the conclusion was that this is heavily related to language and culture. As it is in Ireland now, we see that divide is basically linguistic and cultural rather than religious. So, although religion is also part of culture, but let's look at it in that sense, and we see that that's always invariably the divide in peoples in self-determination conflict is linguistic. So, colonialism we know is prejudice and racism, but where there is this conflict between two sides like this, it can turn pretty nasty into a form of fascism, and a lot of the post-colonial writers regard colonialism to be the root of fascism. And we can see how states sometimes, oppressive states can sometimes get into very, very dodgy actions.
Okay, and and when we spoke the other evening, you were expressing reservations about the about a second referendum as being a means to it because of the demographic changes that have occurred. It may have accelerated since 2014. Could you explore that more?
Well, again, when I did the research for the book, there was to look at the determinants of independence. There are many going back from, as I said, culture, language, colonialism, institutions, and demographics is another. But what we also found in the recent literature is that a referendum is not a requirement as a matter of law for independence.
No. Yeah.
Now, if we take that as the standpoint, as a basis, then we can say, well, why are we having a referendum if it's not? And the other question here is, we know that Scotland has a treaty. We also know that Scots are sovereign. And our representatives are sovereign representatives, and it's democratic to elect a democratic majority. A majority, if it's elected democratically. So that's another democratic mechanism. We've already done that 6 times, and still the SNP remains in its in the literature petrification. It's petrified of moving.
Yeah.
It doesn't want to upset the colonial power. So that's the reality we're in. They don't want to move. They are petrified. They're settled into the current status. But the issue as well is that. Sorry, what was your question again, Mark? I've lost it a wee bit.
Just about the demographic changes.
If we go back to that, what I found in the research was 2 things. One is that Scotland is using a local government franchise for national referendums and national elections at Holyrood. Now, these are national elections, but we're using what is called a local government franchise. That's based on residence. Now, countries only use that, a local government franchise, for municipal elections, for local council elections. They don't use that resident franchise for national referendums. And that's across the world. So you have to be.
I just for an example, I live in France. When I was a UK citizen, before I got my permanent residency card, I could vote in municipal and European elections, but definitely not parliamentary or presidential.
I mean,
now I can't vote in anything. So.
So universely, a local government franchise is not used for national elections. So that's the first thing. It's an irregular franchise that has been used, and I think that relates to going back to what Tony Blair described Holyrood as a bit of a parish council. So Westminster regard it in a sense as well. Holyrood is basically a spending department of Westminster, but it's regarded in a sense as a local government entity, and that's why it's allocated by the civil service a local government franchise. One would assume. So that's irregular. The second factor here is the demographics, and because Scotland doesn't exercise sovereignty over the territory, then it has no control over its borders. And if we look at the historical census, Scotland's population has fundamentally changed. Scotland lost between 3 and 4 million people since the Union. That's half the population. Now, that was the largest loss of population.
Just to be clear, I know that the population is roughly 5.5 million now. And was it more like 10 million back then, or is it more?
No, I'm saying it's lost half its equivalent population of today.
Okay, all right.
But essentially, the loss of between 3 and 4 million people over the last 250 years was perhaps the largest loss of population for a country of Scotland's size and population, and far, far greater than the loss of population from England. So something was happening here to make Scots leave. And the evidence that I found in the book was more, it suggested a lack of opportunity, poor housing, illness, and so on. And these factors, and an economy that was largely set up to serve what we know in internal colonialism literature as the core nation, which in this case is England. So Scotland's economy is not that diverse. It was quite highly specialised, as was Wales and Ireland. Wales in minerals, Ireland in agriculture, Scotland in heavy industry and mining and so on as well as food and fishing and so on. But it wasn't as diversified as it would have been, and certainly nowhere near as diverse as England was. So Scotland's economy was quite constrained, and they're really to serve the core market of England and its empire. Okay. So its situation was different. But anyway, going back to demographics, what we found is a lot of Scots have left, but at the same time, historically, significant numbers of people were coming in from the rest of the UK, mainly in the professional groups and mainly from England. So at the same time as Scotland was losing a lot of people through lack of opportunity and poor housing and illness and so on, seeking opportunities elsewhere, we were importing people from mainly England and mainly in the professional classes, in academia, in industry, in government, and so on. That process, since devolution, has accelerated quite significantly. So the population movement from rest of UK, particularly England, has increased significantly since the devolved parliament set up and introduced positive measures, if it's possible, positive social measures. At the same time, England's public sector systems come under tremendous pressure. England's cities have also changed fundamentally. And we've seen what Professor Danny Dorling remarked and called quite a significant aspect of called white flight, where middle-class white people in general have moved out of English cities to rural areas and other areas in the UK, including Scotland. So that's been an aspect. Since Brexit, of course, this movement has accelerated even further. People have moved in increasing numbers from England and the rest of the UK to Scotland for a number of reasons, for a whole variety of reasons, but one of which is, of course, the property market. And the house price values here historically were lower than many parts of England, particularly southern England.
Yeah, sure. So
people have been able to sell a relatively modest property in the south of England and buy something much more substantial in Scotland. Because Scottish sovereignty isn't exercised, there's no control over borders, nothing can be done about this movement. But essentially that movement is at least 500,000 people every 10 years. Now, in a small population like Scotland's, then that has a significant impact. Over 20 years, that's 1 million people. At the same time, Scotland's birth rate is the lowest in the UK. So the census also tells us that Scotland's population is growing, but it's only growing through in-migration. It's not growing through, if you like, Scots reproducing themselves.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
And these are facts from the census. As you probably know, the census this year was delayed until next year. The reasons I'm not quite sure, because the census took place in other parts of the UK this year. But some people have mentioned it might well be due to the independence issue. The reason why this is important is in my book and in the research that has been done that I've looked at, including the Edinburgh University post-independence referendum research, is that people from rest UK have the highest propensity to vote against Scottish independence.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to get a couple of questions. There was one pertaining to we talk about having a referendum, maybe a plebiscite, but while it is not on today's horizon politics, as things deteriorate, would you, Professor Baird, completely rule out an eventual unilateral declaration of independence? And I guess the question arises, I would think that, the withdrawal, a form of that could be the Westminster National MPs withdrawing from the Treaty of Union. How would you see that? I mean, if there isn't going to be if there's no referendum on the horizon, how would could a UDI be done? If so, how?
Well, I think that we have an opportunity at every election to elect a majority of nationalist representatives to withdraw Scotland from the treaty. And the last opportunity we had was in May. It just passed, and Alba Party were proposing that as basically a plebiscite election, in the sense that if a supermajority at the time, as Alex Salmond said, if a supermajority was elected, then they would begin negotiating withdrawal from the UK Union then and there.
Yeah.
So that's the reality. I think any election is that opportunity. As I said, the SNP have had 6 nationalist majorities. And in most territories around the world, one would be sufficient for independence, whether it was Malta, whether it was India, doesn't matter where it is, whether it's Ireland and so on. That is the reality. And it just goes back to where we're into in this post-colonial template, stuck with a party, a dominant national party that is in a sense petrified about moving, unable to move, unwilling to move, and is actually actively holding independence at bay.
Okay. And why do you think that is? You mentioned earlier just kind of the idea that they're comfortable, they're serving the colonial administration. Do you think there are other reasons beyond that? Just sort of, how do you read the current situation in Scotland?
There may well be reasons we don't know, but all I can point to is the post-colonial literature tells us this happens. Mm-hmm. You know, it actually tells us this happens. It's one of the good things about research is you can see what's happened before elsewhere. Yeah. And the world is not short of decolonized territories. It has
certainly not the British.
Yeah, well, this is it. Britain still has more colonies than any other country, according to the UN, that are on the decolonization list, including some of the Caribbean offshore equity fund places, if you like, that are kept for strategic reasons. So territories are only kept for selfish reasons. Seeks its accommodation with the colonial power. It then puts hurdles in the way of radical nationalists that want to take independence forward. It delays independence. By the way, at the same time, they are feathering their own nests. Yeah. So there is a financial incentive for them not to do anything. People are continually electing them. They don't have to act. The other thing we go to here is the degree of petrification, and that is a fear. It's a bit like rabbit in the headlights thing. Mm-hmm. They're standing there with sovereignty in their hands, but unwilling to assert it. Yeah. But I think fundamentally, the other issue here is the people and the politicians that are in power don't necessarily understand what independence really is. Mm-hmm. And we then go back to why is the need for independence? And it's not a case of reforms in this and that. It's not a case of policies on this and that. Independence is fundamentally about freedom and liberation from another entity that's holding you tight through the various arms of the state, as George Osborne called them. And that colonialism, we have to remember, is. So Scotland, for example, voted in the Brexit vote to stay in the EU, but by force we are kept in, if you like. Scotland has had 6 mandates now for a referendum, but by force we are refused one. So that probably explains why there is a degree of reticence amongst the SNP people. But I think fundamentally most of the SNP politicians don't really understand themselves what independence is. What don't they understand? I could see from their perspective, okay, of course we want to become independent, we want to set up a better state, all of that rhetoric, but what do they not understand in your view? Well, I think they don't understand that independence, even if you look at the UN literature on self-determination and the Declaration, independence is also about decolonization. No, that's a word that just doesn't come up when you. I mean, it doesn't come up. It doesn't come out. It's not part of the vocabulary. But when you analyze it, as I've done for my research, then it does. And the same was the case in Ireland. Would we regard now Ireland to be a former colony of the UK, of England? And the UN does. UN has said that in the past. Ireland was a colony and was mistreated, and terrible injustices inflicted on Ireland, and exploitation. But as I said, it's not just a case of injustice. With colonialism is injustice in all respects, but it's also fundamentally about political and economic exploitation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. And do you think it's possible when we get independence, we can get all of our land back from the royals? And I'd like to frame that question a little bit. And if you could just give us a little bit of the history of the Highland clearances. I'm not an expert on it. From what I understand, basically after maybe it was before as well, but after the Treaty of Union, there was a lot of land given to dukes and earls, in Scotland, and then they cleared off all of, there was the Highland clearances where they just, put these people on, often on boats to America, or just displaced them. Given your knowledge of the history, that's I'm sure more precise than mine, how would you describe the Highland clearances, and what do you think the prospects for reclaiming that land?
I have to confess, Mark, I'm not a historian. But what I would say is the clearances were not just in the Highlands. If you look at Scotland's loss of population historically, up until particularly the 1930s, and between the late 19th century and the 1930s was when I think some 2 million people were lost from Scotland. So that was the high point. And there was empire mechanisms, the Empire Resettlement Law, I think it was called, which basically gave incentives to employers and others to move people out of Scotland. So we talk about the Highland clearances.
I'm sure that was my grandfather was, I think, part of that, because he was a very able member of the civil service. This would have been in the 1950s. And and he and my dad moved around. He was in Wales for a while for rebuilding, but he was a really good, very, very competent, capable person. And so I guess they took him out of Scotland. I don't know, but
this is it. Millions of people didn't just leave Scotland; they were incentivized to leave Scotland. A lot of my family ended up in Australia. And in fact, in the 60s, in the early 1960s, my father had a ticket, £10 ticket to go to Australia with my mother and the 5 kids. but due to my grandmother becoming ill, decided to keep us in Edinburgh and work through constant recessions for the next 30 years. and unemployment in the building sector. And before I became an academic, I spent some time as a painter. And when Mrs. Thatcher came into power,
painting buildings.
I was a house painter, yeah. My father was a house painter, and his father and all my uncles were house painters. So I came from a long line of house painters. But in 1980, I found myself on a bus from George Square with thousands of other Scottish building tradesmen going to Germany and Spain to work, because there was no work here. And this was just part of a long line of the reality of people having to live in poor housing, low wages, unemployment at extremely high levels in many cases. And then that followed, that period then led to deindustrialization. And then the creation of the Scottish Parliament through the pressure of the people coming to bear that something fundamental had to change. But this goes back to the point I was making earlier, that Scotland's economy, any colonial economy, is really only there to serve the mother country, if you like. It's not developed as it should be, and its people aren't developed. Its people are cast out to the 4 corners of the world. For God's sake, Scots are everywhere for a reason. But as I said to you, the British government of the time, but even back to the 1930s and before, were incentivizing people to leave Scotland. Now, and then at the same time, they were bringing in a meritocracy. Now, this has all the functions of colonialism at play here, where people are being displaced intentionally, and that's the reality in the historical census, as far as I can see. And then you bring that to the current day, and we're seeing this displacement, in a sense, continuing, the very lowest birth rate on record in Scotland, but a population growing through in-migration from the rest of the UK, mainly England, and it's mainly property-based and also higher levels of employment-based. Because remember that all the best jobs in Scotland are advertised in the London press. Which I've compared, in a sense, it's a bit like Denmark advertising all their best jobs only in Berlin. Which is a fact, because Denmark's quite a comparable country to Scotland. But anyway, that's the reality of the situation. So Scotland's population is rapidly changing. And again, we go back to this question of culture and language, which forms identity. And that's why they were big factors in my book. Culture and language form your identity, and then
just to give a plug on your book. Please tell the audience the name of your book and the author.
Yeah, it's called Doun-Hauden.
Okay.
The Socio-Political Determinants of Scottish Independence.
Okay.
It's only available, I think, from Amazon.
Okay. Unfortunately.
But well, they've got a big base.
Another imperialist venture, but anyway.
Yeah. But anyway, what I found was, these are a lot of the issues I found are things that people don't talk about in the independence debate. The intellectuals don't talk about them. Possibly for the main reason is most of Scotland's intellectuals, certainly in the academic world, tend to be more unionist.
Yeah. Well, I was just listening to a lecture by Noam Chomsky on the role of intellectuals and the way that they're kind of bred to serve power. If they don't say what they're saying, that they wouldn't be where they are, and that they have this important role of serving state power. And so I think.
Well, one of the factors I found in my book, one of the subjects is institutions, and public institutions, of course, social institutions reflect the social hegemony we have, which is mainly Anglophone and mainly unionist. And this goes back to the fact that Scotland advertises most of its best jobs outside Scotland. But if you look at the universities as a case study, and I spent 25 years in one, so I know a little bit about it.
Which university?
In Edinburgh Napier.
Okay.
One of the new universities in the 1990s. But if you look at the elite universities in particular, as I did, and three of them, I found that only about 10% of the academics are actually Scottish. Now, I was a visiting professor in Norway and certain other countries, and I would say it would be the reverse there.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
and I don't know about France.
It's pretty much all French. I'm an American, but it's maybe it's flipped.
You're an odd one.
Yeah, no, I'm the exception.
But I found the same in Italy, where I taught in Italy, and it was all Italian professors.
Yeah, and even in the English department where I teach, it's mostly French. I mean, and they're. And so,
but you have to ask yourself.
I think maybe among 20 of my colleagues, something like that, there are 4 or 5 of us that are either American or British English type thing, or native speakers. The rest are French, even in the English department. So,
well, what I found in that part of the study was, only about 10% of the academics at elite universities, certain elite universities in Scotland, are Scots. And if you look at the researchers coming through doing PhDs, who are the future professors and future academics, it's probably even worse. There are very few Scots doing PhD work in these institutions. It's all international students, which is very good and well. But what I'm saying is Scotland's universities don't necessarily nurture the Scots and don't provide the opportunities that they would under normal circumstances. Had Scotland been an independent country, it would be developing its own people to a greater extent.
Yeah. Okay. And I know that I'm sure you're chomping at the bit to talk about maritime policies, but so tell us a little bit about your background in maritime policy, and then also how Scotland could radically transform maritime policy, transportation, ports, infrastructure, these types of things.
Well, this also goes back to the book in a sense, because I've worked in many places around the world on research projects, collaborative research work, And Scotland has all the features of a less developed country in maritime sense. So the great estuaries of the Forth, Clyde and Tay have never seen new port infrastructure since practically Victorian times. Now, as you probably understand, being near Le Havre, most ports have completely changed in the last 50 years, as we've seen containerization change world trade. And I started off life, before I was a painter, as a shipping clerk in Edinburgh, just at the beginning of the container revolution and ferry transport as well. So it's two areas I've studied quite intensely. And in fact, my PhD is on container shipping.
Okay. So when was this? When was this roughly that you worked in the industry directly?
I started in 1974, 1970s.
Okay.
So basically the 1970s, pre-Thatcher, if you like. That's when I learned all about shipping and Scottish trade, going through Scottish
the golden age of pre-Thatcher.
But what actually happened with shipping in Scotland was quite like many other sectors. Companies were bought over by mostly London-based companies, and then they were quickly shut down in many cases or streamlined, which meant job losses. Activities were then transferred mostly down south. So Scottish trade, instead of going out through Scottish ports, was sent down to ports in England. So that's what happens when you've got no control over your territory. But so Scotland wasn't competitive thereafter in developing its international trade. So we, as I say, we've not seen modern port developments in central Scotland now for a very, very long time. So it means our ports are no longer competitive. In my research, I found that most countries develop their competitive advantage through having or one of their competitive advantages is in having connectivity, and modern ports is one of the ways to do that. So yeah, I've worked on projects to develop the ferry service from Rosyth to Zeebrugge. Was one of my projects to get super fast ferries to run that service. They ran it despite expensive port charges and other aspects which chased them away. They ran it for a few years and proved there was a market there. But it's relatively easy to develop a new service through what the European Commission calls its Motorways of the Sea policy, which allows member states and neighbouring countries to develop sea corridors by tender. So there's nothing to stop the Scottish Government doing that. And I think people like Kenny McCaskill are asking the Scottish Government to do that now, to develop a motorway of the sea. I've worked on a project also to develop Cockenzie as a modern cruise ferry port. The Forth is the capital city region, if you like, is one of the only capital port cities I've seen in the world that doesn't have a modern cruise and ferry terminal. Yeah. So we still berth cruise ships as we did when I was an agent in Leith back in the 70s, out in the middle of the river, the bigger cruise ships, and then tender everybody ashore like a less developed country does. Yeah. and that's no good for turnarounds, because the cruise industry, what you really want to do is the turnarounds, where the ship comes in and everybody comes off and a whole series of new passengers comes on. So you get then all the hotel business, all the airport business, all the other auxiliary business, and supplying the ship with millions of pounds worth of goods and other things for its next trip. The ferry service is absolutely vital to Scotland now, because we see with Brexit the shortage of truck drivers and the congestion in the channel ports and the problems with England's motorway system. Scotland's at the end of that supply chain, and that supply chain is broken already. So Scotland needs its motorways of the sea. And there's another project developing by a guy called John Burley on the west coast, a Gourock to Spain and France connection via Ireland as well. Ireland, as you probably know, has about 7 or 8 connections to the continent, France and Spain mainly. Scotland has none. so we need to do something. The other big project I worked on was to develop a container transshipment terminal in Scotland. And that was at Scapa Flow in Orkney, which has natural water depth for the very biggest container ships. And this was also a development sought by the company that developed a similar facility in Malta Freeport, Marslick's Lock, which is a container transshipment terminal right in the middle of the Mediterranean. But they wanted to develop a container transshipment here in Orkney for transatlantic business and other traffic, intra-regional traffic, Baltic, North Atlantic, Ireland, Iberia, also connecting via Scapa Flow. And this project was prevented by the Scottish Government and the UK government from happening. mainly because UK transport policy is about pushing all the activity to England, to the south of England. And that's the other situation where we need independence to overcome that bias, if you like, against development in Scotland.
Okay. And how do you see getting the resources necessary? I mean, you hear that constantly referred, how are you going to pay for it? But what do you see as the way that if Scotland becomes independent, obviously the sooner the better, the ways of financing it, the ways of, and what would you see as the top priorities? What port, where, how, that kind of thing.
Well, these ports are quite easily developed internationally by tender. All a transport authority or a government agency has to do is specify what it wants. It wants a port, so it specifies that port. It then tenders for operators to come in and put in place mostly the superstructure. So it's a kind of partnership. The European model or the global port model is more of a partnership. The UK port privatisation policy just simply sold the ports to private equity funds, offshore Cayman Island or wherever. So they're all owned by offshore private equity groups, and they're also regulated by these groups. So the port authorities were privatised in Scotland and in the rest of the UK. And this is totally abnormal internationally, where all governments internationally keep hold of the port authority function and also control the port planning and port pricing as well, because port pricing can completely destroy an economy if private equity funds are in charge of ports and port pricing. Then they can make an economy uncompetitive just through very, very high port pricing practices. So, and that's what's happened in Scotland, where the taxation levied on ships, tankers, for example, has always been quite significant, and also cruise ships. So it drives business away. So this privatisation model we have in Scotland, which is from Thatcherism, basically, but it's also, I think I mentioned to you, it's what my continental academic friends call the Anglo-Saxon model of port privatisation.
Yeah. That's the way we view it in France,
where public monopolies are basically given to offshore private equity funds. Yeah, and nobody knows who owns these funds as well. So nobody really knows who owns Scotland's major ports.
And I know you described it as an anomaly, but just if you could describe for our viewers that, is it completely unique in the world? And you were saying, I don't know, people from Holland or elsewhere would say, what are you doing?
What happens in these countries, including the US as well, is the ports and are generally owned by the state. So the port real estate is owned by the state. The state then plans what terminals it wants, and then it advertises a lease for the private terminal operators to come and lease a piece of terminal. So the port authority is the state. And this is the same in Rotterdam, Hamburg, Los Angeles, New York, Rio de Janeiro, Dubai, wherever. So the port authority, the public sector control the infrastructure. Yeah. And they lever in the investment from a leasee, from somebody who's taking the lease on the terminal. That's what happens. But what's done in the UK, what's been done in Scotland, is the ports and the port authorities were just sold and are now owned by offshore equity funds. So there's no planning of port infrastructure. There's no modernization of port infrastructure. There's a self-regulation which taxes every ship coming in as it wants. And therefore, what we see is no trade growth. We see no trade growth because we can't grow the trade anyway, because there's not the port infrastructure to take it. All these equity funds do is sweat the asset. They sweat the asset until it's broken or until they can sell it to some other equity fund. That's the same with airports.
And what would you in terms of actually creating upon Scotland becoming independent, what is the first thing you do, first of all, to give Scotland the power to regulate, or own the area and to own the port zones and all that? And where would you build ports, and what types of ports, and that kind of thing? What are the most strategically important places that ports should be built?
The former head of transport for Highlands Islands Enterprise, Roy Peterson, and I wrote a maritime policy paper for the SNP Westminster Group. 3 years ago, I think it was, and they've done nothing with it. But it basically said set up a marine agency, a marine authority, and it set out all the areas that marine transport authority should deal with. And the strategic port assets that were required initially was the development of a modern European gateway port at Cockenzie on the brownfield site of the former power station. It's the only site on the Forth that you can do this with a tri-modal terminal, rail access, road access, and river access. And is the closest point to the continent for a ferry service, and that's very important. The other aspect was to create an international container transshipment hub at Scapa Flow for the transatlantic trade and also for intra-European trade, Baltic trade, and Irish Sea trade as well, and also for the future traffic that's going to develop through the Transarctic. So these are the two main opportunities. All it requires is the Scottish Government to put in place the policy, the agency. In terms of funding for these ports, most of the funding can be brought in through a tender process where the international terminal operators would take the long-term lease on the terminals and develop them in partnership with the public sector.
And could the Scottish Government do that even under the devolved powers that they have, even short of being, becoming independent? Is that something they could do?
Yes, there's actually a question I asked some years ago, and Keith Brown also asked the ministry in London when he was Transport Minister, was who has responsibility for ports in Scotland? And he was told it's Holyrood.
Okay.
So yeah, there's nothing to stop them developing a ports policy. Where the UK government would come and object, probably, not that they could do much about it, is by saying international relations is a reserve matter. And I think Holyrood's had its knuckles wrapped before of doing anything international. It can only do domestic things, like domestic ferries, but not international.
You don't want the Scottish Government to get any ideas in their head about being
that's it. They don't want to get ideas above their station, which takes us back to the colonial administration thesis, which basically is, if you're being told you can't deal with international things, you can't have international arrangements. But there's nothing to stop them tendering and getting investors in ports. And there's nothing to stop them having a port policy to develop trade. In fact, that's what they should be doing, but they're not. They're in that sense, they're entirely negligent, and they've not been willing to address the legacy of the UK port privatisation policy that's holding Scotland back.
What is the difference between free port and green ports? It's a question that came up. I wasn't aware of. I'm not. Go ahead.
Free ports have been around for centuries. Most container transshipment terminals are free ports. They're actually, what it usually means is there's a free trade zone connected to the port. So usually within the port estate, it's a free trade zone. It means that people can then import goods, add value to them, and export them again without any duty. So a good example might be the big car terminals in Zeebrugge. Trade cars come in, they're discharged from the ship, they're put ashore, and then they're PDI, things are added to them, things are changed to the cars, then the cars are re-exported. But they've added maybe a couple of thousand euros of value. So what they're importing is increased in value. So what the free trade area usually does for a host country is it grows the value of exports. And that's what it should be. That is particularly suitable for transshipment. And that's where the Orkney project was very interesting, because quite a few sectors, such as drinks, seafood, other sectors, were interested in doing transshipment there and storage of goods for different markets. The Baltic, Iberia, Scandinavia, and so on was very interesting in that. So I think that's very important. The new concept we've seen in recent years is the green port, low emission port. It's basically a low emission port. And this is where Cockenzie would be particularly suitable, because you've got the substation there for the offshore wind farms off the Fife coast. So the cable comes into Cockenzie. That's where all this renewable energy is coming in. So it can be used for alongside powering of ships when they berth. They don't have to run on their engines. They can plug into the system, the shore system. And also you could have a land-based system for handling cargo, for example, using electric vehicles.
Mhm.
You could also, if there's barges going upriver to Grangemouth or across to Fife with containers for the whiskey industry and so on, these could be electric barges like they're introducing on the Rhine from Rotterdam and Zeebrugge as well. So a green port could be mixed with a free port and a free trade zone. I don't think the Scottish Government has acted very well on its decisions on green ports and free ports. It doesn't really understand that the underlying problem is our port infrastructure is obsolete. The underlying problem is our port infrastructure is not competitive. And if your port infrastructure is not competitive, you won't have any trade. And that's why Scotland's trade is not growing. We are not a competitive economy. That and other factor aspects like high energy costs. High energy costs is another aspect. In an independent country, we should really drop down the energy costs because that's what's killed our industry. We've been resource rich for generations, but our industry has been high cost because of UK pricing policy and privatisation policies. So this is why our economy is underdeveloped. It's not got the levers that we need for energy, for transport, for trade. And trade's the only thing that's going to really grow the economy. Trade is a big factor. And global trade is well, with globalization, it's grown enormously. And that, for most countries, that's been a big benefit.
Okay. I wanted to get in one last thing before we wrap this program up. Someone was asking about how would we go about bringing the Scottish case to the UN. I mean, we talked a little bit about the decolonisation commission that they have. I don't know if it would have to be it would have to be the Scottish government, or how do you see that? I mean, could normal Scottish citizens petition the UN to consider Scotland as a subject to decolonisation, or how do you see that?
My understanding is that any individual can approach the UN if it wishes, but the fact remains we've elected national representatives to represent us, and they want independence, or so they say. So they should be searching for any means for independence. But as I said, for a number of reasons, they're not doing that. They're actually holding independence at bay and delaying independence, which actually creates more problems for people in the long run. And the situation will get worse. It won't get better. So they have to address this. They have the options to end the treaty-based alliance through a majority of national representatives. As Kenny McCaskill said, this can be done through MPs, MSPs, and councillors joining together in a constitutional convention. That's also what Ambassador Craig Murray has suggested in the past. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a very valid mechanism. Scotland constitutionally is in a treaty-based alliance and has sovereignty, so shouldn't necessarily need recourse to the UN decolonisation process. But if somehow Scotland's sovereignty is not respected, and neither the treaty or sovereignty is respected, and Scotland is held in a sense by force, then that would be the time to approach the UN, because that would mean that Scotland, I don't think there would be then any doubt that Scotland is a held territory, otherwise a colony.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Anything else you want to say before we say goodbye to our, maybe a bit of note of optimism in some sense, or?
Yeah. I think probably just maybe a quote, if I may, from Frantz Fanon. I think that what we are seeing with the light of experience is the symptoms of a great weakness about understanding what independence really is. And what Fanon says is, while the native thought he could pass without transition from the status of a colonized person to that of a self-governing citizen of an independent nation, he made no real progress along the road to knowledge. His consciousness remained rudimentary. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the message I would say to the politicians who advocate independence is not just their consciousness, but the consciousness of the people remains in that kind of rudimentary nature. Yeah. We have to understand the state we're in for want of a better term.
Yeah.
And we're in a bit of a state.
Yeah.
So
not only the UK state.
we're in quite a state. So I think that's the message. We have to understand our predicament and then try to pick the pieces through that and extract ourselves in that way.
Okay. On that positive note, I'll say goodbye. Say goodbye to our viewers, and thank you so much, Alf Baird, for being with us. And I hope you'll come back sometime soon.
Thank you, Mark. All the best.
All right.